When the history of the last 50 years of Conservatism comes to be written, one name will loom large, that of Bill Cash, more properly Sir William Cash, who's had a nearly 40-year-long distinguished career as a parliamentarian, all of it served on the back benches. Bill Cash is a convinced Brexiteer, and in 2016 he saw his lifelong ambition vindicated in the outcome of the 2016 referendum. Bill Cash is also a lifelong Catholic. So when I sat down with him at his Shropshire home, I of course wanted to know about how his faith and his religion had impacted on his political life, but we started by talking about his childhood and his formation. Bill Cash, welcome to New Humanum, and thank you for agreeing to do this interview. I wonder if I could begin just by talking about your early life. What sort of household were you brought into, and what was family life like when you were young?
Well, I was born on the 10th of May 1940, which is a rather extraordinary day to be born on, because it was as I was born at 5:30 in the morning, Hitler invaded Holland and France, and Churchill became Prime Minister that evening. So I think my mother had quite a lot to think about. My father was doing artillery training down in Warminster, and I was brought up basically with my father being away almost the whole time, by my grandmother, who was from County Cork, and very strong Catholic, and my mother too, who was also a very strong Catholic. So I was brought up in that environment, and my father was killed in the war in 1944, so that tended to point up and to emphasise my Catholicism, because I was being brought up in very much a Catholic family.
Was your father not a Catholic?
No, he wasn't, no. The fact my family going back generations were Quakers, but they had become Anglican because I think the call to try and get into Oxford and Cambridge sort of emerged during the late 19th century. But no, my family were Anglican, and then but I was Catholic, and I was brought up, and this is a very important part of my life, when I was sent to a Jesuit school in 1948, and I was 8 years old, and it was run by the Jesuits, and I learned an enormous amount when I was there, and then I went on to Stonyhurst from there in 1950.
Tell me about that. What was a Catholic public school like Stonyhurst? What was it like for a young boy in those days? Quite strict, I would think.
It was strict, but it was fair. And we understood that. I remember going up to the school rules set out in the corridor and looking at them, because I wanted to make up my mind as to whether or not I would found all the rules as acceptable as everyone assumed they should be. And I went through them. I think there were about 14 or 16 of them. And I came to the conclusion all of them, with the exception of one, were in the interests of everybody, and therefore they could be accepted and you should obey them. So I didn't have a problem with any of those rules, but the one I could not accept was that you couldn't go to the post office. And I wanted to buy stamps to send letters home and things like that. Of course, the real reason they didn't want people to go to the post office because they could buy cigarettes. But I mean, that was just sort of a rather idiosyncratic way of doing it.
So the fact that as a young boy or an adolescent boy, you were reading the rules in that way, a pointer maybe to the fact that later in your career you became a constitutional lawyer. I mean, this is so the boy is father of the man.
I think there may have been an element of that, and certainly my grandfather was a lawyer as well, so it was part of a family tradition, and eventually I did go into the family firm. But basically, Stonyhurst was very important in my life. I was obviously an only child, except that I did have two half-brothers, because very fortunately my mother married again to a wonderful man who lived in Sheffield. So we moved to Sheffield, and we all went to church together, and we became very much a part of the... I went to the Catenians and all that sort of thing. And then after that, at Stonyhurst, as I grew older, I became very imbued with the sense of not only we serve Mass every day, had no trouble with the religion at all. I didn't have, as I think Cardinal Newman said, 1,000 difficulties don't make a doubt. And I was very much drawn into the whole of the Jesuit framework. And it was incredibly important to me because I knew where I was. We could tell the difference between right and wrong. We were constantly being taught how to think properly and how to make the analysis that led you in the right direction. So that was part of an educational experience. And there were the most wonderful, the Arundel Library. We even had St. Cuthbert's Bible, which they've recently sold, believe it or not, I believe for about £7 or £8 million. But these were artifacts, part of the Arundel Library, which was quite famous and still is. So we were brought up in a very religious atmosphere. Yes, discipline, but it was actually fair. I don't think, although it would nowadays be regarded as unacceptable to give people smacks on the hand and things like that with these things called ferulas, but we just accepted it as a sort of normal part of life. We didn't sort of take sort of human rights actions against the school.
There was a great sense of security, perhaps, and certainty in English Catholicism back in the 1950s. I mean, I was born in early 50s, so I came in. So I understand things have changed dramatically in that respect.
Yes, they have. I am a traditionalist, and I remain so. And if I'm to make a big of a leap in time, I can tell you never once have I ever, in the whole of my time in Parliament, which is now 39 consecutive years, have I ever voted for an amendment to make abortion possible or mitigated. I've never, ever, always make it a point, as a matter of conscience, to make certain I go to the debate, and I will always vote against abortion because I just don't believe it's the right thing to do.
And is that, do you think, just the consequence of having that sense of right and wrong imprinted on you at such an early age?
Yes, I do, and I think it's a very beneficial thing because it means that you've thought it out as well. I think there was I remember one of our teachers at school says, does faith presuppose reason? And the answer is, to me, yes, it does. Because although you believe because you know what you've been taught you believe to be true as a matter of conviction, but if you relate that to reason as well, because you can see the benefits of being straight, consistent, principled, then, without getting pompous about it, you know where you are. And I think one of the problems, if I may say, about some of the young people who have been brought up today is that they don't have that moral compass. They can't make the distinction. And with the social media that prevails today, anything goes. And everybody's opinions are as important as anybody else's. And that's patently not the case, because otherwise the world would be, and I believe is becoming, increasingly disordered. And if I may just mention that the online safety bill, which is going on at the moment, I was sitting in my office and I had the television screen on and parliamentary proceedings were going on. I wasn't in the chamber. And I suddenly thought to myself, why am I sitting down here? I ought to be in the debate. So I went upstairs, which is only a matter of sort of 2 minutes away, and I entered the debate and I started intervening. And then I noticed that somebody else called Miriam Cates was also engaged in it as well. And I said, look, we've got to sort this out. And I went and sat next to her and we talked about how we could go about it. And I said, I think we can win this one. And what I'm saying to you, what happened then, because the bill was in quite an advanced stage at that point in time, I just hadn't addressed it sufficiently or really been aware of what exactly was going on in it, because children were being induced by algorithms into self-harm and suicide, and I just could not believe that this was going on. And when I really grasped what was going on, she and I, in the space of 3 weeks, managed to get the government to listen to the arguments that we put together with a lot of analysis and research to demonstrate how bad it was. And I then brought forward with Miriam, who, by the way, also came from Sheffield, which is an extraordinary coincidence, but a very happy one. And although she'd only been in Parliament a very short time, she was really engaged in this very soon and very rapidly, with huge articulation as well. And the bottom line was that we managed to get a clause agreed with the government to impose imprisonment on the big tech bosses who were wittingly allowing all this to go on. I could spend much more time on it, but in a nutshell, that was entirely driven by these same impulses and but the rational analysis that went with it. And you can't solve problems just by feelings and emotions. You can only do it, and certainly in the parliamentary context, if you bring reason and analysis, persuasion to bear with the conviction that lies behind it.
So, conscience, you set conscience as your guide, by the sound of it, from very early days. I mean, the Jesuits, of course, have a reputation within the Catholicism of being the intellectual heavyweights of the faith. And was it a very intellectual upbringing that you had at Stonyhurst? Would you, looking back on your education then, was it an education which concentrated on the classics, and was that what it was?
Well, it's curious really, because I ended up doing history, English and French at A-level, and I loved doing all three. But on the question of the classics, at O-level Latin, I had a very, very high mark. I won't brag about it, but it was very high. But I couldn't cope with the Greek. And that really took me out of going to university to do classics, because I couldn't.
Would you have done? Would that have been your preference, had you been able to master Greek?
No, I don't think so. I actually, when I first I was fortunate to get into Oxford, and I went to Lincoln College, Oxford, and I had brilliant tutors there. But I'd also had very brilliant teachers at Stonyhurst. One of whom was called Anthony Levy, whose brother Peter Levy was a very famous poet and became professor of poetry at Oxford. And they were a very formative influence in my last 2 years at Stonyhurst. And also other teachers like Geoffrey Holt, who were not so well known, but actually very, very, very good teachers. So we were very well taught. So the intellectual base from which I was able to go to university was very well grounded. And I can remember things and ways of looking at things, and the philosophical classes that we had. A chap called Russell Colbert, who was a real philosopher, and we would sit there and we would talk about all these different matters, and of course with this enormous hinterland of this religious school within which we were being brought up.
Did you find, when you were in Oxford back then, was Catholicism mainstream? Was it unexceptional? Did you come across any anti-Catholic prejudice at all? No,
not at Oxford at all. There were quite a few Catholics at Lincoln.
Does it have a tradition?
Lincoln did have quite a few Catholics, but not that many. We were always a minority, and one would go down to the chaplaincy, where we had Father Michael Hollings, for example, and we didn't sort of wear it on our sleeves as much as one might have expected. I mean, my first ever speech, if I may just refer to that for a second, funnily enough, was because I took no part in politics at Oxford at all. I was entirely cricket, rugby, squash, all that kind of stuff. Met my wife, and that also took up...
Was she at Oxford too at that?
She wasn't at Oxford. She was doing her A-levels at the time. And basically, I sort of grew up in that kind of environment. But the chaplaincy was important. You went to church every week, of course. The other people, there was no anti-Catholicism that I was ever aware of, ever. But just to go back to my time at school, there was a thing called the Catholic Evidence Guild. And there were young people, I was aged, I think, 15 or 16, and if I may be permitted to just tell a little story about this, it was quite extraordinary. I went down, we had a Jesuit priest with us to sort of keep an eye on what happened. We went to Hyde Park Corner. And there was also one at Tower Hill, and there was one at Charing Cross Road. And you would get literally onto a soapbox, and then you would just talk about your faith. And I was engaged in this. It was on papal infallibility, and I can even remember it was my first ever episode. And I was, thou art Peter, and upon this church I'll build. Upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall never prevail against it. I'd learned it all pretty much by rote, I suppose, but I was doing this. And there was somebody on another soapbox about 10 or 15 yards away who had a sort of fairly largish crowd standing around him. And then the moment came when, for some reason, they started drifting away from him and coming listening to this pipsqueak who was talking about papal infallibility. He then got off the soapbox and came in and joined in and heckled me. And then at the end of it, and this is the punch point, the priest said to me, who was our sort of guardian for the day, "Do you know who that was?" And I said, "I've no idea whatsoever." "No, of course I wouldn't know, would I?" And he said, "That was Don Soper." So that was my initiation. That was my first ever public speech, actually, funny enough.
It says something about you that you could choose papal infallibility, a pretty knotty subject to address in public as your first exercise in public speaking.
Well, it was an extraordinary experience. I shall never forget it. But actually, yes, suppose you're right. I found I've never had a problem with it as a subject.
No, me neither. But it's quite a difficult sell.
Yes.
In a public forum, I think.
I think you're right. Yes.
But you. Oxford, and then the law. You trained as a lawyer.
Yeah, I went into a family firm in Lincoln's Inn Fields.
And was that just a sort of natural progression for you, or?
Yes, I read history because I started out doing law for a short time, and then I came to the conclusion it would be better if I did history. I think it gave me more room for playing cricket and rugby and things like that, if I'm being honest. I think and I knew I was going to do law afterwards, so I transferred to history. And I was very lucky indeed. I had a brilliant two very brilliant historians, one of whom was Vivian Green, who became rector of Lincoln College, had been senior tutor, but he also, his great claim to fame as well was that he was also the prototype for Smiley, because John le Carré and he were very, very close friends. And then there was John Owen, who taught me 18th century history, and that's really where my constitutional law emerged from.
And what about so you're a young man, you're in the family business in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Where does politics begin to enter the equation?
It was entirely after I'd left Oxford, although there was one incident much further back when we had a retreat at Stonyhurst. And Bernard Bassett, who was also a Jesuit, a very famous preacher, was doing the retreat. And in the course of retreats, you go through a phase when, you know, you're taken, sort of embraced by the it's meditation, and it's silence, and you listen to what they say, and the concentration is quite considerable. And I went to see him, and I said I wanted to inquire whether I might possibly have a vocation. And he said, well, I'll certainly talk to you about this, and he did. And we spoke for about an hour and a half, I think. And then at the end of it, he said, I'm absolutely clear in my mind, you don't have a vocation. He said, but I do think you're going to go off and do something later in your life, which is going to be born out of the kind of questions that you've been answering and the manner in which you approach the questions that you think are important. So he said, I can see something happening there. And funnily enough, John Owen said much the same, my history tutor, when I was at Oxford. And so the mixture of having been brought up by the Jesuits and then subsequently being at Oxford and reading history had a very powerful influence on my thinking. And the constitutional law, which I learnt from the 18th century history that I learned, became very much part of my sort of thinking processes. And then I came to the conclusion that although Bernard Bassett had suggested indirectly that I would be interested to go into politics eventually, I then realised that that was what I really wanted to do. But of course I wasn't able to do so because I had to get, first of all, I was earning £3 a week as an article clerk for a start, and I just got married. My wife was a Downing Street garden room girl, and she was earning £10 a week, you know. And so gradually I realised that, you know, I had to earn my crust. So basically becoming a lawyer precluded me from going into Parliament or anything like that. But I did do I started working in constituencies, doing work at a ward level. In other words, in a particular council, I wasn't a councillor, but I would help to sort of get the ward organised and raise money and things like that. And so that went on for a very long time, but not being in a position to go into Parliament because I had to continue to pay school fees and things like that.
So on my ready reckoner, you must have been in your 40s then when you first actually entered Parliament. And from what you just said about the retreat and the what you took away from that, in fact, is it fanciful to think of politics as a vocation?
No, I would say emphatically yes.
Yes.
I mean, for me it is.
Yes.
And that's why it's so much easier for me to take decisions based on what I really believe.
And what is the definition of a vocation in that sense, in your mind?
Well, a vocation is that you carry through by your public actions your beliefs which you hold privately and which you've gained from your experience, particularly, for example, at school and also at Oxford. So it's a mixture of things, but it's distinguishing between what you should do as compared to what people want you to do, and sometimes what you must do. And there are those moments which are not necessarily that frequent when you know you cannot do anything else. And that's really what took me into the field of the European question, which we don't need to go into in detail. But basically, it was all about believing in democracy, yes, representative government, and not being governed by another majority vote of other countries.
Because I think in the public mind, you would be associated and known for your opposition to the integration of the United Kingdom into a supranational European entity. I mean, that is what is it fair to say that is your life's work? I think probably, terming it in those phrasing it in those terms actually makes it sound as if you've done nothing else. And I know that isn't true, but it has been central, hasn't it?
It has, and I had to make a decision and I got into Parliament in '84, and they put me on the European Select Committee. And as a constitutional lawyer, having done some pretty high-powered work before, because I was 43 by then, and I'd already got an established, if I'd made, presume to say so, reputation in terms of advising on the Quebec repatriation proposals and North Sea oil and also the invasion of Grenada and many other really big constitutional issues, Crown agents and Lloyds of London and so on. And I used that knowledge, but I also came to the conclusion when I got on the European Select Committee there was something seriously wrong. And that was that we were being governed by virtue of a provision in the European Communities Act 1972 that we would accept any decisions that were taken and we would implement them. And I say this, Robin, not once from 1973 when we entered the European Community to the moment we left in 2020 did we ever amend or reject any provision ever made in the European Community. Now, basically the decisions increasingly were made by majority vote, and that meant that you were effectively being governed not by what your own members of Parliament who were elected by individual voters were deciding. It was made as a rubber stamp. You were actually endorsing the decisions taken in the Council of Ministers, which was operating behind closed doors and by majority vote of other countries or by consensus, and at the same time without even a transcript. And I compared that with what was going on the face of it in the British Parliament, where you have this complete free speech combined with open debate, Hansard published every day, people knew why decisions were taken, you had select committees and so forth. And I said, this is just wrong. It doesn't have democratic legitimacy. That was the moment of truth. And as far as I was concerned, from that moment out, it was a step-by-step approach. I mean, the idea that you were going to go out and say, I'm going to leave the European Union tomorrow, would have been fanciful, just like that. But the reality was that I put down this amendment on sovereignty in June 1986. I remember graphically, I was the only person who had an amendment along those lines, and I wasn't even allowed to debate it. And that really bothered me. So from that moment on, it became, I would say, something that had to be pursued. And it wasn't blind conviction, it was a reasoned assessment that this was not proper democracy that we were in the European community.
It must have frustrated you then, during the course, the very long, decades-long course of the debate over Europe. I felt that from the other side of the fence, I was working, as you know, at the BBC, I felt that that issue, which you outline there, this issue of democratic legitimacy, was never given full weight in the public debate that we had. It was certainly in Parliament, but as it was reported, it was all about economics.
There was never, ever any discussion I can ever remember about that question of democratic legitimacy. Nobody ever, the best way to keep a secret is to make a speech in the House of Commons. And I have to tell you, I can't tell you how often I've said majority vote behind closed doors without a transcript. The bottom line is they never wanted to do it.
No. Why is that?
Because it's lethal.
Yes.
Because actually, once you explain to somebody that their member of Parliament was actually simply pursuing a path which had been determined by other people, and that your own arrangements, constitutional arrangements inside your own Parliament were to implement the decisions which didn't have democratic legitimacy in terms of the decisions taken by the voters in your constituency, and they didn't know that actually it wasn't an act of Parliament which had been voluntarily decided upon. It was something which had been imposed upon them. So for practical purposes, and the same with statutory instruments. So the reason that I kept going was very simple, because I just could not accept the idea that this should be allowed to continue. But you had to form alliances, you had to form relationships with other people, you had to, above all else, decide how you were going to be able to get people to be extracted from this lack of democratic legitimacy. And the answer was a referendum, because the collusion between the two front benches meant there would never be any change. So you had to get Parliament itself to agree that it would abdicate its power to make those decisions according to what the European rubric said, but actually to do it within the framework of an Act of Parliament which was passed by the members of Parliament, agreeing that they would allow the people to make the decision. And that was a really important decision which I arrived at in the early 1990s.
And with huge consequences. Tell me this: how is a Catholic conscience consonant within the framework of Catholicism? What should we make of democracy? How democracy, the Catholic Church, of course, isn't a democracy, and never has been and doesn't pretend to be. Yeah. But for you and for many of us, democracy is nevertheless a sacred thing in a way.
Oh, it is. It's a sacred trust. There's no doubt about that. I've said that often enough in the House of Commons.
So that's it.
Yes,
but why is it? Why should democracy matter to a Christian?
Because it's freedom of choice, and the freedom of choice itself is freedom of conscience. So you make up your mind whether or not you're going to go down the road of obeying a particular law or helping to create a particular law on the basis of a freedom of choice, which is a matter of conscience. And one of the great things about the British Parliament, the United Kingdom Parliament, is that when we have matters like abortion or issues relating to termination of life and things of that kind, these are all conscience matters, and the British Parliament abandons its party politics at that stage, and then you have completely free votes, which is a marvellous thing. I mean, it may be as I've lost the votes over and over again on these issues because I have been outvoted, but I know that I've exercised and been given the right to exercise my own decision-making according to my conscience without the whips interfering at all.
Throughout the course of your life, though, I would say as an observer that it is the progressive side of politics which has by and large shaped the culture, and that social conservatives, if you accept that as a definition, social conservatives have lost out on most of the major issues of the past 50 years, I would say.
Well, I think I think the development very recently of the woke culture and social media, which doesn't distinguish between reasonable arguments and prejudices. It's just an opinion which is put forward without careful consideration, I would say. Everybody's opinions are as important as anybody else's, which is not a very rational way to go about things, but it's enveloped society to a very significant extent. And the other thing is that there are groups of people who have used their influence in organisations such as the BBC in order to be able to impose their view of life on other people. And that's when you get into the issue of impartiality, which is one of the central questions affecting the BBC. We've had it recently with the Gary Lineker affair, but it's much more than that, actually, as well, because it is possible to be impartial and to make decisions, and the Charter itself requires impartiality. The trouble is it's not and hasn't been enforced. And there are hopes that in the next few months this will change. We shall see. But if the culture of the BBC, which after all is a monopoly, and license fee payers, like taxpayers, contribute to it, and there is no conceivable basis in my mind why people should have inflicted upon them views that have been put together by people who have very strong prejudices and then want to effectively brainwash the population in their own fashion with a nodding acquaintance with notions of impartiality, which I believe are simply just don't stand up in reality.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It seems to me that the media has foisted on the country a new morality, which is a morality which comprises of rights and wrongs according to a progressive lexicon of transgender issues, gay issues, whatever you want. The media has been, and the BBC particularly, has been on one side of that argument for the past 50 years, and it really has not entertained a proper debate about these serious moral issues.
No, well, I very much go along with that, and in fact, it's also humanism as well. It's a mixture of things which are not based on what I would describe as a proper basis for society to make decisions, even as a matter of conscience, even within Parliament. You actually need to be able to have a proper and public debate about things, and the absence of the degree of impartiality which is essential to do this, which is not rocket science. Mm-hmm. When a person is being chosen to go onto a programme, it becomes self-evident that that person is being chosen to promote a point of view that the producer believes is the right thing to adopt. And there are exceptions. I mean, I can't say that it's an entire operation of brainwashing. What I can say is that there is insufficient regard given continuously to the need to have a proper examination, objectively or even subjectively, by people who don't agree with the producers or with the people who are putting the programme together.
I think that that's exactly right, and the problem is that people don't understand the mechanism by which television programs, radio programs are actually produced. You know, as you say, very often what happens is that the program the program is designed to bolster and prove a point which is prearranged.
Yes, exactly.
The producers and the program makers start out knowing full well in their own mind exactly what they believe, correct, and they tailor the program to prove their point. Now, we've gone a long way down this road. One doesn't, there are things now which one would fear to say in public for fear of being prosecuted for hate speech.
Well, this is another side of the same equation, which is basically that it becomes it's the use of a monopoly in the case of the BBC, which is funded by the taxpayer or the licence fee payer, which is offensive in itself. But it's also more broadly the case in other parts of the media as well, and not so much the print media. It's much more the visual, which is the problem. And there is this lack of self-criticism about views that are being put forward to other people. And you'd think that those people who are so devoted to their own opinion of righteousness, that they are the right people to tell other people by whatever means and manipulate the interviews in such a way as to make it clear that that's what you should believe in. And it's actually completely contrary to what they appear to be presenting themselves as. In other words, there is a massive hypocrisy in this too.
Absolutely. I mean, your adherence to a very clear guiding star, which is your informed Catholic conscience, has it cost you in your political career. I know that, I mean, you are a proud backbencher and you've never taken a government job. Is that because you could not in conscience have done so?
It's because I knew perfectly well that I'd be on the point of resignation within a very short space of time. And it's not a very good place to be in. There's no point. I knew that would be the inevitable consequence. And it was really the only way it could be done would be from the backbenches. Now, it's against all the odds because nobody was ever, for a minute, I can assure you, in the early days, going to take anybody seriously who suggested that we might disengage from the European process and project. But actually, people do listen eventually, providing you are sufficiently clear and determined, and it's based upon something which goes beyond just simply party politics.
Was it always for you going to be the Conservative Party? Was there ever the possibility that you would have stood for another party?
No. And actually, the curious thing is that my family have had about 7 members of Parliament since the 1840s, and they were all Liberals. John Bright and his brother and many others. And basically, they, funnily enough, and certainly John Bright, eventually ended up becoming a unionist, a liberal unionist in 1885, where he was under attack by Lord Randolph Churchill in the Birmingham seat. And what happened then was that he decided that on the question of the Irish issue, that he would take his stand, and he did. And that morphed into liberal unionism, followed ultimately by, in 1910, I think it was, when they decided to call themselves the Conservative and Unionist Party. So that element of the radical, free-thinking, liberal tendency represented by the likes of Cobden and Bright and their successors, eventually, through their interest in free trade and their interest in democracy, which after all was delivered by Disraeli in 1867, but driven by John Bright himself, actually ultimately became part of the unionist element of the Conservative Party. So yes, I'm a Conservative, but I'm also a unionist.
You see yourself very much in that tradition, perhaps.
I do, but it wasn't very thought through.
No.
I think it's a kind of instinctive belief that it's right that people should look to values of the kind that Edmund Burke believed in. That's the starting point, I think, for the Conservative Party. If you're a Burkean Conservative, then you're going to remain that for the rest of your life.
I think many Conservatives would say, and many social Conservatives would say, that the Tory party has disappointed them quite frequently in recent decades. For instance, the Samesex Marriage legislation was promoted and brought in under a Tory Prime Minister. What's your feeling about?
Well, I voted against it for a start. I mean, but we're not. It's a serious matter because civil partnerships and things of that kind are now the law of the land. But the fact is that when they were being brought forward, we put up arguments and voted accordingly, demonstrating that we didn't agree with it at the time. But then it becomes the law of the land. But it's at that moment that also, and this is also the case with the transgender issues and with other matters of a similar kind, and on abortion and a whole range of conscience questions, I would put them as, where you find yourself embracing ideas as a parliament which you as an individual don't necessarily agree with. And that does create considerable difficulties. And when, of course, they become criminalised so that you would be regarded as a criminal for making statements which, when the legislation was being proposed, you could speak freely about. Once it becomes the law, it appears that there is no way of going back and re-evaluating whether that was necessarily the right thing to do in the first place. And I think that is a constant problem, which means that there is a need to re-evaluate a lot of the things, some of which are really quite recent, which are changing society in very radical ways, and which organisations such as, if I may say, the BBC, for example, don't question in the way in which they deserve. The questions do need to be examined and re-examined and reviewed. Life is not a constant movement towards greater and ever lasting ability to form judgments without reason and careful consideration.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm sure that you follow the debate on abortion in the US, as I have over many years. And of course, theirs is a different system, but there a determined campaign over many decades resulted in the overturning of the Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court. And so there they managed to keep the debate alive. We, on the other hand, have not managed in this country to keep the debate alive about abortion, for instance.
No, I think that there are people who really find it an impossible situation because they don't believe that there should be abortion. And I've made it clear that, as far as I'm concerned, I've always taken a vote against it or any attempt to extend it to a sort of more progressive direction. But it's not just abortion; it's also a lot of other related social issues, and I think that the criticism that I would have of the way we've conducted ourselves has been this failure to review a situation after a period of time. Now, in America, they have the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, it's also true that the Supreme Court can be packed, so that for practical purposes, that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, I would say it's not a good thing. You need to have judges who can form judgments based on the interpretation of the law. The question, therefore, is what is the law? And unfortunately, our social legislation has become far too progressive, in my opinion, and it continues to be so with regard, for example, to the termination of life. That's another very big issue on which I would never vote other than in accordance with my conscience.
Because there has been a long-standing and very determined campaign to get euthanasia legislation in this country.
And by the way, I do want to say that the Catholics are a fair number in the House of Commons by any number, but there are also many other people who take exactly the same view, who come from other faiths, whether it's Methodist or whether it's Christian or whether it's Muslim, that you find actually that it's quite a melting pot of opinion.
Oh yes, I don't doubt that. I mean, it's just that we must accept, mustn't we, that we live in a secular society, and secularity is, of course, a sort of umbrella system where people are free to follow their own confessional beliefs. But
toleration is essential.
Toleration is essential. I feel sometimes that the progressive side doesn't always extend toleration to people of Christian persuasion.
No, and there's a really big problem internationally on this as well, because there's no doubt at all that there are certain countries who are absolutely determined to persecute Christians, and that we know who they are, and they do it, and it's certainly the case in China and in other parts of the world, and it's a really massive international problem as well, particularly with the movement of peoples from different countries and different continents and the speed with which change can take place. So that is another massive problem.
Do you ever feel pessimistic, despairing even about the state of society? It is easy sometimes in a black mood to look at what's happening and think that there is a kind of moral chaos which surrounds us, and people seem to have lost the ability to distinguish between right and wrong.
Well, that is exactly the point that worries me, but I will say something else, which is that social media and the kind of things which drive this extended humanism, this inability to be able to tell right from wrong, and to completely avoid any religious conviction, can only ultimately be resolved by toleration as expressed in legislation. I don't think the fact that you happen to have a belief in itself is sufficient. I think that it's necessary for legislation to be proportionate and tolerant, but also to be based on reason and persuasion and analysis. And if it turns out that the things that people have assumed were the right things to do when Parliament passed a particular piece of legislation, it should be reviewable, and you shouldn't therefore be precluded by some form of criminalisation from being able to talk about it. And there are a group of members of Parliament which are becoming increasingly influential, and things are happening at this moment in time with regard to free speech, which are now becoming more and more prevalent in Parliament. And there are some new younger members who have come in who feel very strongly about it. But how that is going to be worked through, because it's just beginning to become a really important part of the parliamentary scene.
Isn't one of the lessons, perhaps, of the story of our disengagement with the EU, the whole EU debate, isn't the lesson to be drawn from that what once seemed impossible, i.e. leaving the EU, and must have seemed at times to you also a very distant prospect, actually became a reality thanks to a very determined and consistent campaign by you and others. I mean, so that should be cause for optimism, perhaps, about some of these other issues.
Well, I agree entirely. And actually, it was the belief that it was the right thing to do, based upon a rational analysis of what was going on, which led to the determination to carry it through. And I think that the great, and I've said this many times in the House and outside, tribute is to be the British people, because they're the ones who made the decision. We provided the mechanism and the ability and the drive and the determination to get the arguments in front of them, but they made the decision. And when they did it, it really surprised the establishment. And they haven't actually ever quite forgiven us, I don't think.
Or ever got over it.
Or got over it, yes. And but the fact is that it's a decision that's been taken. And to put it the other way around, imagine engaging in a new debate, which is what some of them would like to be able to have, about going back into the European Union, and then asking the individuals who were the voters who decided that they wanted to leave, plus many of the people who actually didn't want to leave, a simple question: do you want to be governed by laws that are made by majority vote of other countries behind closed doors without even a transcript? And you'll get the answer: we're not going to go down that road again. And I'm sure that that is what will happen.
I always thought that one of the underplayed aspects of the referendum decision was that, in a way, we were giving an example of democracy in action to the rest of Europe. And some other countries, for instance the Irish, who were notoriously forced to vote twice because
yes,
they
were.
The wrong answer.
No, I took part in their referendums, and also in France. Frankly, it was the opportunity for people to be given the chance to make that decision, which had been really excluded from the ideas and the machinery of the project for political union. They couldn't believe that people would actually want to make a decision except on their terms. But actually, when it came to it, it surprised them all. It surprised them in France, the French. But the difficulty is that in the case of the French, for example, we actually won a referendum. I took part in it with Philippe de Villiers. And then they just didn't take any notice and they went on. That's the difference. When the British people made the decision, it became something which was embedded. I'm afraid that in some of the other countries, it hasn't been the same.
Sir William Cash, I think it's fair to say that your political career, unlike so many others, has resulted and culminated in the realization of something you have held dear for many years, this idea of a proper functioning democracy governing our country. So it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Very nice to have a chat.